On today's World Insight, the U.S. and China prepare to sign a trade agreement. What outstanding issues warrant a Phase 2 deal? And Taiwan residents head to the polls. What kind of change will the election bring to Taiwan? Here's our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. Let's begin today's show with the China-U.S. trade deal. The two countries are set to sign a Phase 1 trade agreement in Washington next week. The deal was reached in early December after months of sometimes tense negotiations. Take a look.
A trade deal between China and the U.S. is moving closer to completion. China's Ministry of Commerce has confirmed that the two countries will sign their Phase 1 agreement next week.
At the U.S. invitation, Politburo member and Vice Premier Liu He will lead a delegation to visit Washington from 13th to 15th to sign the Phase 1 agreement with the United States. The two teams are in close communication on specific arrangements.
The Phase 1 agreement marks the first stage in resolving the trade dispute between the two countries, which has dragged on for nearly 22 months. The feud was triggered in March 2018 when the U.S. launched what are known as 301 investigations into China's trade practices and the treatment of intellectual property. Washington started slapping tariffs on Chinese goods, and Beijing retaliated in kind. The back and forth escalated into a fully fledged trade war in July last year, with the two countries imposing levies on nearly all categories of each other's exports. Tempers continued to run high throughout 2019, with numerous accusations from the U.S., including calling China a currency manipulator. Some Chinese companies still remain on the U.S. export blacklist, making it almost impossible for them to purchase American-made goods.
America's streak of wrongdoing has tremendously escalated the trade friction. It has not only seriously affected the interests of enterprises and consumers of both countries, but also will cause a recession in the global economy.
Amid all the twists and turns, the two nations held a total of 13 rounds of high-level trade negotiations, with the latest in mid-October. Then in December, Chinese officials announced that Beijing and Washington had reached a consensus on the text of a Phase 1 agreement. Some Chinese experts believe this agreement amounts to a truce declaration. Taking the heat out of the trade dispute will not only benefit the two countries, but also the whole world.
For more on China-U.S. trade deal, we have in Washington Jeff Moon, an international trade and government affairs consultant who's also the former assistant U.S. trade rep for China. In Beijing, we have Li Yong, senior fellow and standing council member of the China Association of International Trade. Welcome to both of you, Mr. Moon and Mr. Li. May I start by asking you if the deal will be signed, Phase 1, next week, as planned. What does it mean for the overall momentum of U.S.-China trade negotiations and discussions when we look at the way forward? Mr. Moon.
We don't know exactly what's in the deal because the negotiations have been secret and the terms have been leaked selectively. But the thrust of what's been leaked so far, from what we know, it appears that basically this Phase 1 deal is all about relieving the pain of the trade war. The U.S. is going to lift some tariffs. The Chinese are going to purchase some food that they needed anyway. There are several other provisions that are mostly recycled promises, like the promise to provide national treatment, and various half measures like the promise, the supposed ban on forced technology transfer, which has many loopholes. So this is a very limited agreement. It really does not address the underlying causes of the problem between the U.S. and China. Our leaders have failed to address those causes, and that lack and failure of leadership has caused us to not be able to cooperate in the ways that we should so that we can truly prosper together. And as a result of that failure, we're going to continue to slide toward decoupling. I hate to be so
All right.
negative about it, but we really need to get our leaders to focus on what's at issue here.
Well, your leaders is having some problems at home, I'm afraid. Probably it has a lot to do with your own
Those are
election
irrelevant.
season, right? So, Mr. Lee,
Those are irrelevant.
also to you, what does that mean? If this deal is signed, phase one is signed next week as scheduled, what could it mean for the future discussions, negotiations, interactions between China and the U.S.?
I think this is going to be kind of a positive move in terms of the both sides' effort to try to strike a deal. In the past over 20 months, I think both sides have experienced a lot of twists, ups and downs, on and off type of negotiation. And finally, I think the two sides have been able to find a kind of a common ground, or the largest denominator, where they can reach the kind of initial agreement. But this is actually is going to serve, I think, as far as the second phase is going to be concerned, as a kind of initial understanding for the both sides to move forward. And of course, if this is going to be signed, I think it is going to be beneficial for the manufacturing, businesses as well as the farmers. But generally, I think it is going to be having some positive impact.
Mr. Moon described it as relieving the pain. How would you describe it, Mr. Lee?
The pain is there because the tariff is going to hurt not just Chinese exporters but also the importers in the United States. Recently we read about a research report by the National Bureau of Economic Research. Almost 100% of the tariff burden are kind of taken by the American side, but of course, Chinese exports has also been affected, but it means it doesn't really do good for either side.
Mr. Moon, what's going to happen to the tariffs? Now we are seeing the tariffs are still there to a certain extent. We also know in a global supply chain, when tariffs is inflicted upon one big player on the global supply chain, the other players on the chain would also feel it, and not to mention the close economic and trade ties between China and the United States. So, Mr. Moon, what's going to happen to the tariffs and also the impact on both sides? Mr. Moon.
The tariffs are clearly going to remain in place. This deal does not affect the $350 billion of goods that are still going to be subject to tariffs.
No.
Those tariffs, I think, are not wise, and those tariffs undermine both the business capabilities and business confidence of business people both in China and the U.S. and globally. So this is the problem that remains, and this is part of that failure of leadership that I described before on both the American and on the Chinese sides.
Mr. Lee, the U.S. side inflicted tariffs on China first, and then China reacted to that. Now we are seeing both sides are trying to reach certain consensus as a result of phase one. So what's likely to happen to the agriculture sector? Now Chinese side has made it very clear the increased imports of agricultural products coming from the United States, as might be indicated by a phase one deal, is not going to affect the imports of others agricultural products into China. That has already made very clear. And China is going to administer very closely the improvement of the trade in agriculture. So, Mr. Lee, what does that mean? And what does that mean also for China to have various diversity of choices, no matter it's in agriculture or in other areas of trade, Mr. Lee?
I think agricultural products is an important part of the negotiation, as it has been China's position since the beginning, I think, of the negotiation, that China will import American agricultural products because it is part of the the Chinese demand, because the local production or the Chinese production will not be able to satisfy its demand, particularly the demand for animal feeds. So this is really something that I think China will purchase, and as a matter of fact, China has already started to renew the purchase of soybeans and pork, particularly, and pork import is going to alleviate the current pressure on the pork price.
Yeah. Mr. Moon, to you, it's not going to be about the agricultural process, but I'm interested in the so-called export ban. The U.S. has set, whether it's from different branches of the government against China, whether it's about artificial intelligence technologies, or it's about people or talents interactions, or many other areas. Mr. Moon, what shall we make of this? Is this going to be good atmosphere as we move on to the second phase or other kinds of interactions?
Well, these are the kinds of problems that should have been addressed in the Phase 1 deal and need to be addressed. China's industrial policies, the China 2025 program, and the failure of the Phase 1 deal to address these things. We're going to move, I think this is the high watermark of the negotiations game. China has made it clear it does not want to talk about industrial policies in China 2025. And so we're going to move from a negotiating game to a ground game where the U.S. will start imposing reciprocity on the protectionist Chinese practices that have been in place for a long time. And so we have already seen those mechanisms come into play. We see restrictions on Chinese investment into the United States. We see restrictions on export of American technologies. We see restrictions coming into play, the import of Chinese IT products as well. These are all the kinds of reciprocity, parts of that reciprocity phase that we're going to move into because we have failed to be able to negotiate and resolve things.
Mr. Lee, it's no secret that the U.S. side has been using the word so-called reciprocity to illustrate all the new measures, trade sanctions, as well as bans of certain exports to China to describe its latest actions. But Mr. Lee, of course, the Chinese side disagree, and that's an important part of the negotiation. But Mr. Lee, to that point, how is China looking at the future or the potential of negotiations? And once actions by the U.S. side, for example, banning of artificial intelligence technologies, which the two countries are very much intertwined with one another, mean for the overall global value chain, global innovation chain, and global supply chain? How should China be prepared for that?
I think reciprocity is one of the issues, but I think with the adoption of the new foreign investment law, China, I think, has further opened market access to foreign investment, not just to the American companies, but if we look at the U.S. side, I think the trade war has distorted the kind of level playing field that are supposed to be there in the United States, and even for American companies in the process of a tariff exemption, for example, there's a kind of a discriminatory type of exercise in terms of the companies applying, for the exemption, and in terms of the future cooperation in the AI, in the ICT areas. I think the future is going to be hinging very much on the political consideration, not really on the the industrial supply chain type of situation, and definitely the global supply chain and the supply chain relationship between the two countries will be affected by the the measures that has already been adopted and will be adopted probably in the future.
Well, although we have seen some interesting phenomena, Tesla, for example, has already established its factory in Shanghai, and the very latest model likely to come out with relatively much lower price than it used to be because it's done with a lot of efficiency. Having said that, though, Mr. Moon, there's a lot of uncertainty with your government, whether it's impeachment or the Iran issue already at the very beginning of the year, coupled up with the DPRK nuclear issue, as well as many other crises. together with an election year. So how much can your counterpart, whether it's China or others, trust the commitment made whether at the executive branch or at the other branches of government by the U.S.?
Well, I think that the fact that there are things going on domestically is not really relevant to the trade issues that we're talking about here, except to the extent that they somehow become linked. I mean, there are lots of domestic issues in China that I'm not going to mention that are also going on.
But you have some problem that is not exactly the same. You have an impeachment against the president by one political party in the House of Representatives going on right now. You have Iran, which in your country already talking about whether there's going to be an imminent war. And you also have very different situation now in DPRK. This is not something you find very relevant in all the other capitals around the world. Mr. Moon, let's just face the reality here. So how much Washington can be trusted now with this Phase 1 deal and also even further discussions with China or the other economies? Well,
okay, let's be frank here. Frankly, Trump is not going to be impeached. The Iran situation has calmed down quite a bit, and yes, it's a busy world out there. There will be other issues out there, but we can walk and chew gum just like China can walk and chew gum. But what your question is really getting to is whether China can trust Donald Trump. That's the real issue here. That's not the question I'm asking, but if that's your interpretation, go ahead. Well, no, that's an issue that's of much discussion because he has a very volatile and unpredictable negotiating style. And that's something that I can't tell you how that's going to play out. We will just have to see how that works. I do think that, remaining within this topic, I do think that there will be Phase 2 discussions that will result in nothing, certainly during his first term. Maybe something if he is reelected in a second term, but I think it's very speculative to think that there would be a second term. I see. Mr. Lee, also about that point, how much will China be able to implement the deal once the deal is signed? That's very important, isn't it? I mean, both sides about the implementation. China also.
I think, China has the market in terms of the purchase promises. I think this is there already. I don't really need to say anything more about it. With regard to other things, like the so-called the forced technology transfer, this, it's just really difficult to find some, examples that can really characterize China as a kind of a forcing foreign technologies. There might be a number of cases, but it's not really a big issue. In terms of intellectual property protection, I think it is also in China's own interest to protect. So it doesn't really, I don't really have any concerns about the China's side of the implementation. We are running out of time, but I'm sure the discussions about this, as always, with two of you and many other scholars from China and U.S. will continue. I want to thank both of you for joining us and providing your insights from your perspectives. Jeff Moon, coming from Washington, D.C., and Li Yong in Beijing. Gentlemen, really appreciate it. Thank you. You're watching World Insight, still to come on our live program. The elections in Taiwan, while the residents are heading to the polls, what kind of change will the election bring to that locality of China? Welcome back. You're watching World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. Taiwan residents will vote to elect the leader of the region on Saturday. Candidates have been holding mass rallies on Friday in a final push to convince voters. Take a look.
Plenty of enthusiasm on display at the two main parties' pre-election rallies in Taiwan. But one party appears to have much more reason for optimism. The woman who has led Taiwan for the past 4 years, Tsai Ing-wen of the pro-independence Democratic Progressive Party, has a healthy lead in the polls over her KMT rival, Han Kuo-yu, an improbable prospect just a year ago. But then came the Hong Kong protests.
Well, Hong Kong was supposed to be a showcase for one country, two systems policy of China, and ultimately the one country, two systems policy was supposed to include Taiwan. After the intensification of the series of protests in Hong Kong, I think the DPP was able to make use of that issue.
While the DPP painted the policy as a failure, analysts say KMT candidate Han struggled to address Taiwan people's concerns.
Han underestimated the impact of events in Hong Kong, mainly the political fallout, and he didn't give voters, especially the younger voters, the impression that he would be able to stand up for Taiwan's interests. He tried to repair that image, but it was too late.
Han has tried to capitalize on concerns over the DPP's handling of the economy.
KMT is, of course, selling the idea that if a KMT candidate is elected, then the cross-strait relations would improve, and thereby the economic livelihood of Taiwanese would similarly improve.
But polls suggest that's not likely to be enough to lead the KMT's Han to victory over incumbent Tsai of the DPP, though analysts say they expect the result to be a lot closer than the polls have been indicating.
For more about what to come in Taiwan, let's go to the two guests we have. In Taipei, we have Joanna Lei, former CEO of the Chenghua 21st Century think tank. Also in Taipei, we have Cheng Youping, Director of the Political and Economic Research Center. Ms. Lei and Mr. Cheng, what a pleasure to see both of you. I do not want to talk about the elections directly because it's an election the localities is having right now, and the peoples need to go to the polls to make their own decisions. But rather, Ms. Lei, I want to emphasize on a few things. First of all, what do you think voters are really looking for from Taiwan?
Well, I think in a race this tight and this polarizing, most people believe that economics and other issues will not be the major determining factors. However, it so happens that the two main DPP party platforms and their main campaign agenda happen to have very huge and dire economic consequences. So while Han Kuo-yu, of course, used the typical change slogan, asking people, are you better off? But at the same time, people are very careful. The concerned electorate are thinking whether the no nuclear power plant by 2025 will really yield a green Taiwan, or it will actually deteriorate our economic basis as well as increase our carbon dioxide emission. In addition to that, the Resist China, Protect Taiwan slogan, which Tsai Ing-wen stood in front of a host of candidates and saying that she alone can protect Taiwan from China, is also being challenged because lots of people believe that regional integration and economic integration is the outcome for Taiwan's future. Without such, Taiwan will be an isolated, marginalized little island, and those two issues proposed by DPP both have very strong economic consequences plus their own livelihood. So all three are economic concerns.
Mr. Cheng, economic issue is the big issue. In fact, you see that reflected in so many different ways in economies around the world if you look at the chaos and disturbances over the past year. Mr. Cheng, to the residents in Taiwan, how specifically are those economic issues?
Well, most people in Taiwan are really very concerned with the economic future of Taiwan. Frankly speaking, just as Joanna just said earlier on, Han Kuo-yu asked people, are you better off? Are you happy today than 4 years ago? Are you worried about Taiwan's future? People are very worried about Taiwan's future because they don't know where Tsai Ing-wen is leading them to. Tsai Ing-wen's policies, especially with regard to the cross-strait relations, suddenly has put Taiwan in a very dangerous spot. And Tsai Ing-wen's position in the Asia-Pacific region seems to hold the United States as her major ally in fighting against mainland China. And that is not a welcome sign, because among most citizens, people will welcome a peaceful coexistence, peaceful development with mainland China. People don't want war or confrontation. Most citizens feel that they want a comfortable life, they want it back. But 3.5 years gone by, Taiwan has not produced any significant economic results. And therefore, tomorrow's election, I think it's going to be a major sign of people's dissatisfaction with Taiwan's and DPP administration.
Ms. Lei, how vulnerable has Taiwan been, or will Taiwan be, if Taiwan is being used as a bargaining chip by some major power in the world, whether against China or for their own political or geopolitical advantage? To people in Taiwan, do they understand this issue inside out? Ms. Lei.
Well, I think there is a clear generational gap between people in Taiwan in their understanding of such gravity. Most people in 40 and or above, those cohorts, have either themselves experienced near war or their parents, their grandparents have experienced it. So they understand that war can be imminent at any given time, and the outcome is always disastrous to all parties involved. But for the younger generation, they're hearing a rhetoric by Taiwan's government that now Taiwan is in its most dangerous time and there is an imminent threat across Taiwan Strait. And Taiwan and her colleagues are the only ones leading them to wage such resistance. And these young generations have no historical recollection, such as 70 years ago when cross-straits are still at a warring state, we have experienced huge disastrous outcome in a true warring state, and they have no such recollection. So young people tend to believe that the KMT is appeasing without regarding their future and believing Taiwan could be the resistance leader. However, Taiwan being situated in the center of the first island chain, we are always part of any regional conflict or potential regional conflict. And Taiwan's history has been changed in many, many times due to regional conflicts. So I think people in Taiwan are deeply committed to peace and stability of the region at all costs.
Mr. Chung, when people cast their votes, and even beyond, how much do you think real communication of the significance of this issue is being done? I mean, about peace and stability across the Taiwan Straits, about Taiwan not being manipulated by Washington, for example, as a bargaining chip in the latter's dealing with Beijing, Mr. Chung, particularly now.
Well, yes, I would have to say that most Taiwanese people do feel that Taiwan is only a pawn in the game. In other words, Taiwanese or Taiwan's government is not going to be a chess player in this game. You're just a pawn in the hands of the big powers. In other words, Taiwanese often feel that they're being tricked into playing along with the United States as a proxy in this region. And a lot of people feel very uncomfortable with the arms sales because American government obviously are selling outdated, expensive, which is not applicable to Taiwan situations, the kind of weapons, and they're selling us weapons that we don't really need. And people feel that we're being cheated, we're being taken advantage of. And many young people today, frankly speaking, even though they may buy into Taiwan's lies or deceptions, but they suddenly feel they certainly don't feel like going to war, and nobody is willing to fight for the so-called Taiwan independence, for sure.
Of course. It's one country, two systems. It's one China that across the street that has been agreed upon throughout history that has led to peace and stability, at least for now. And Ms. Lei, Mr. Cheng, if I could, before we go, we have 1 minute left in our discussion. How do you think Taiwan will be able to survive and thrive economically at a time of great uncertainty of all areas? Here I'm not talking about just regionally, but also internationally, when you see a lot of different uncertainties, both geopolitically and economically. Ms. Lei first.
Well, certainly, if you look at the U.S. plan, including in the NDAA 2020, Taiwan is a critical part of its West Pacific game plan. However, Taiwan must remain flexible in forming its alliances and safeguarding its current relationship with all neighbors independently, so that it will have its ability to choose how and when and if to form different alliances to the best interests of the people in Taiwan. And that freedom is very important.
Mr. Cheng, you have 20 seconds left, I'm afraid.
Taiwanese needs to understand that a stable and peaceful cross-strait relations is the very foundation of Taiwan's economic prosperity in the future.
Joanna Lei, and Cheng Yo-ping, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. And also, for more on the issue, I sat down earlier with Yang Mingjie, the director of the Institute of Taiwan Studies at the China Academy of Social Sciences. He thinks whoever is elected the leader of Taiwan should prioritize people's livelihoods, and Taiwan should never become the bargaining chip between the United States and China. Let's listen in. Professor Yang, welcome to CGTN.
It's my great pleasure.
What do you make of the likely result of the election?
It's very difficult to make the forecast of elections.
Yeah.
I don't want to make a kind of gamble on that, but my personal opinion, I think no matter who will be elected as the leader of Taiwan, but there are some facts we can learn from the elections.
Like what?
The first one is that the ordinary people's life and their requirement have gave a, I think, big influence for the elections. That some people use the word 庶民 means ordinary people, especially for the low-income people. And during the development of Taiwan economy and social development, but they found they are isolated from the society. Their income is not increasing, and they are isolated from the social welfare systems. So they hope that the new leader, no matter DPP or KMT, pay much attention on their daily life, on their life standards, on their stability and safety.
But having said that, though, we have seen the temptation coming from some in Taiwan trying to block more interactions between the mainland and Taiwan, particularly so-called banning support on certain kinds of social groups and activities. Professor Yang, will these efforts in a way distance Taiwan further from the motherland?
My personal opinion, I have some afraid about that, because no matter what law or legislation will be made in the future, but if DPP will continue its regime, I think they will enhance the so-called network to defend Taiwan. So what's the meaning of network? But for me, it's not network, it's a gap work. It will make distance between the mainland and the Taiwanese, not only on economic level, but especially on people-to-people's level. They will have some, worry about the green terrorism or green terrorism regime.
Green terrorism, meaning the ruling people.
The ruling people use their power to make some like terrorism that just give a flag and we will punish you, but never know that you will violate the law. So that's ambiguous. law can be regarded as a
the ambiguity of the law, in a way,
Yeah.
indicating.
Yeah.
On the other hand, Professor Yang, what do you think of the future nature of the Taiwan issue in terms of its impact on China-U.S. relations? Now, China has always said it is the core of this bilateral relations.
For me, I think it can be regarded as two things on both sides. One side, the Taiwan issue is an internal affairs, that no matter what will happen in the outside world, and the cross-strait mainland and Taiwanese people, we are Chinese people, we will pursue the unification forever. We will enhance our cooperation, we will make integration, and we will do our best efforts by ourselves. That is one side. On the other side, because Taiwan is so conflict issues, it's related to some other foreign issues, like you mentioned about the Sino-U.S. relations. And the United States, no matter who will be the president next term, but I think they will want to increase the role of Taiwan in the framework of Indo-Pacific. That will support Taiwan on military sales and the military defense cooperation, and even some other so-called value cooperation, something like that. But that will make much more dangerous for not only for Sino-U.S. relations, but also for the future of Taiwan.
Yeah. What is the bottom line China has?
Bottom line, I think, is very clear that sovereignty and territory unification.
What does that mean?
That means that we have made in our law that if there is some separation, declaration of separation of Taiwan from the homeland country, that's bottom line. If foreign countries want to intervene in Taiwan internal affairs to damage and to destroy the so-called sovereignty and territory integration, that is red line.
Professor Yang, we have been hearing from scholars suggesting Taiwan needs to make sure it does not make itself a bargaining chip for the United States with China. But on the other hand, people also wonder what's likely to be the way that the mainland will deal with Taiwan. For example, some scholars suggest the mainland has been talking about the military power. They feel being threatened, and they also suggested that the cultures on both sides have grown apart rather than more similarity as they were. Professor Yang, what do you make of these comments?
I don't think Taiwan will play as a bargaining chip, not only for the United States, but also for China. In the negotiation with the United States, Taiwan issues never talked to make a bargain because it's on sovereignty issues. We don't want to make sovereignty issues as a bargaining, as a make a deal. But for what we do for prepare for the future risk or dangers, we can do everything, but the military means always regarded as the last one choice or measures to deal with that issue.
Hong Kong issue.
Yeah.
Some say will have some spillover effect on the issue of Taiwan and Taiwan's relations with the mainland. What do you think?
For me, I don't so pessimistic about the Hong Kong issues' impact on Taiwan. For me, I think we can study that issues from a long term, from a historical view, that Hong Kong issues give us about how could we deal with one country, two system. Maybe we meet some problem, but how could we avoid that problem in the future with Taiwan, with Macau? So Hong Kong is, for me, I think, for long term, can be regarded as one very good practical beginning for one country, two system process.
What have you learned so far?
So far, I learned that the Hong Kong issues is, as I mentioned, the people at first. Because when we do some governance, we have to pay attention to really focus on the people's requirement, as I mentioned about Taiwan issues. Secondly is that we have to worry about foreign intervention. Yeah.
When it comes to foreign intervention, whether you like it or not, there would always be ones who try to do that.
They always want to do, but I said that all the issues decided by ourselves. The foreign intervention is not foreign aid. We welcome foreign aid and foreign investment, But if there's some foreign investment, that will make a lot of trouble and violence. So we can learn from the Hong Kong issue that violence is not welcome by ordinary people.
One of the things people have been talking about is what's going on in the Hong Kong educational system, particularly regarding the young people's knowledge about the mainland, and to build some common memories, consensus with the mainland. Professor Yang, it's no secret that the DPP administration now try to eliminate as much as possible contents related to the mainland or related to the concept of China in the textbooks and educational system. So in the long term, are you worried?
I have some worry, but I also have some confidence about the future. As I mentioned, education is very important. Also that DPP and some pro-Taiwan independence group want to re-education on the Chinese culture and history, something like that. But I think that because that more Taiwanese are visiting China, do their business and education in mainland, they can learn from the news media, from the people-to-people communication that what the culture is, what the history is. I think another important issue is that they can learn from the mainland China that the mainland China development gives them a lot of opportunities. So education not only textbook, it's also practical textbook.
Well said. Thank you so much, Professor Yang.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine or check out our YouTube channel, Facebook and Twitter accounts. I'm Tian Wei in Beijing. On behalf of the team, thanks for watching. Bye for now.